Thank you all so much to be here. It's so nice to see actually so much people for these tipping points, thresholds. And today we have Max Rietkerk talking. It's going to be a talk about ecological tipping points, a bit of history of them, and knowing Max, I imagine, from spatially extended systems and all interesting things. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sasha. Yes, I'm happy to present here my story about tipping points. I come from ecology, and actually also the concept of tipping points is largely developed in ecology before it was applied in climate science. So it appeared in climate science about 2008 with the classical paper of Tim Lenton about elements in the Earth system. But I would like to take you a little bit back to how it was developed in ecology. So therefore, I would like to briefly go through how existing tipping points were basically derived, how the concept was derived, and for that I need to go through a little bit of a simple ecological concept. And I will end the first chapter with a small video about explaining the concept of tipping points so that we are all on the same page. Then I will have a small chapter about early warning signals. And then, as Sasha predicted, I will say something about spatial scale. And from that, you will see that we would need to rethink the tipping point theory a little bit, or maybe a little bit much. And that is where the second video is about. And then I will end with the one. Yeah. So existing tipping points. So I start with a very simple ecological concept, which is that of exponential growth. If you think about your Drosophila in your green container when it's hot, right? This population is growing exponentially. And we can depict that by there is green line fence, but it's okay, I think. If we can depict the growth as a function of the population, and that would be a straight line. And then if you depict that in time, it would be an exponential growth in time. Right? But this is all very nicely if we think about the Drosophila population in a green container, or if you think about the spreading of a virus, the initial spreading of the virus, this is really obeying this exponential growth. But usually populations do not obey this, or obey it only in the beginning of their growth. And this is how the concept of logistic growth appeared in ecology. And we can also depict the growth now as the function of the population itself. And instead of a straight line, it is now this shape in which you have a maximum growth at half of the carrying capacity, as we call it, and then it declines until the carrying capacity. And you can see that here in time, so the population grows, the maximum growth is here, and then it develops towards a certain stable equilibrium, is the idea, which is the carrying capacity. So, for example, if you have a population of deer in a certain area, it will develop towards a certain level above which the area cannot contain any more species or any more individuals than that, because there's a lack of food, there's a lack of space. That's it. Right? So this is logistic growth. Now remember, I both depicted the growth as a function of the population itself. You can also do that this exponential decay, which is the reverse of exponential growth. I depicted it here now as a red line because the exponential decay is a minus, is a decay. And if you plot that in time, it is a decreasing amount in time until 0, and then it's stable there. Now, why do I do this? Is that how this tipping point idea originated? It's actually plotting these curves on the same axis in one graph, as is depicted in this one. So here I plotted the logistic growth, right? That's a function of the population itself. Now think of a population of fish that is growing in the sea. And I can now depict also the harvest of the population, which is depicted here by an exponential decay, which is basically a proportional harvest of the population by, for example, the fishing boats, right? And as the harvest is a decay in population and the growth is an increase in population, we can depict both of them in the same graph, and then we can do what we call an equilibrium analysis, right? Because the equilibrium is there where the harvest equals the growth, right? And in this case, I've depicted a linear increase in harvest as a function of the population. So the more fish, the more harvest, right? But of course, if you have only one boat, then you cannot harvest anything more than a certain constant harvest rate because of limitation of the number of nets, and you get something like a saturation curve, right, which is more realistic. Now the whole point here is that by studying the configuration of these curves, you can tell a lot about the dynamics of the system. Because first you can tell where the equilibria are, right? Because the equilibria are where the growth and the harvest are the same, right? And we can see those appearing in both pictures, right? So, for example, in this case, this is where the equilibrium is, right? And even we can tell more about the characteristics of this equilibrium, whether it's stable or if it's unstable. Because if you perturb this equilibrium, for example, you go a little bit to the right, so you add a little bit of fish, then you see the harvest is higher than the growth and it will go back to the equilibrium. And the same will happen if you remove a little bit of fish, then the growth is higher than the harvest and again it will go back. So this is a stable equilibrium. Right? Now something else occurs if we depict it in this configuration, because then we have another type of equilibrium appearing here that is unstable. Right, so there is an equilibrium because the harvest equals the growth, but it is unstable because if you if the population is a little bit removed from this equilibrium, for example, you go here to the right, you see that the growth is higher than the harvest and it goes to this equilibrium. And the same happens when you move a little bit to the left, so when you perturb it a little bit, then the harvest becomes higher than the growth and you move to the left. So here we have two stable equilibria and one unstable equilibrium in between. And this is important, as I will show you in the next graph. So this is already one characteristic of these tipping point ideas, is that you have two stable states and an unstable state or a threshold in between it. Yeah, and now Mr. Neumeyer appealed, and he applied actually this idea for the first time, studying a grazing system, in which you have the growth of the vegetation depicted in the same graph as the harvest, or as we say in ecology, the functional response of the herbivore. And actually he did exactly the same analysis as I just did before, describing this grazing system. And actually this became a classical paper because from this idea, the idea of tipping points was derived. And after Neumeyer came Bob May, and he actually took this model of Neumeyer and he analyzed it in a different way and he reviewed it. And he was thinking, what happens? So here again is the growth curve of the vegetation. Here again is the herbivory, which is an uptake of the vegetation. And then he was studying what happens if I increase and decrease the number of cattle in a specific area. And then what he did then is, instead of plotting this figure, he rearranged the figure a little bit. And instead he plotted the equilibrium of the vegetation as a function of the herbivory. And then this picture came about, in which if you have a very low herbivory, you have a high vegetation equilibrium. And when you increase your herbivory, this equilibrium decreases until a certain point. Then the equilibrium is gone, it vanishes. And the population crashes onto another equilibrium, right? And this is what is called the tipping point. In the beginning, it was not called tipping point. People called it thresholds or breakpoints, but later it was called the tipping point. And this is actually how this tipping point idea came about by applying these simple concepts and plotting them in a specific way in these graphs. So it's a mathematical concept that was developed in ecology, at least in the 70s. Yeah, so the idea of an increasing, in this case, herbivory and a sudden collapse of the population of vegetation is what we call a sudden shift or a catastrophic shift or a critical transition. Right, and one classical example of that is the crash of the cod stocks at the coast of Newfoundland, which suddenly crashed back in the 80s and the 90s in a kind of a mysterious way. People didn't know what the crash caused, but what the theory tells us is that it could have been just a steady increase of the number of fishing boats and the harvest was being taken from the fishes, and it could, because of this tipping point, it could have led to a drastic collapse. One of the mechanisms that is behind this tipping point is what we call a positive feedback. And a positive feedback is a self-amplifying change. And as an example, I've depicted here a positive feedback in dry savannas. What happens in dry savannas? Where there's not enough rain to sustain a homogeneous vegetation cover, but the vegetation itself can improve the rate of water infiltration into the soil. So it makes the soil wetter. And as the vegetation makes the soil wetter, it actually can grow better, and there are more plants, and as a consequence, there's more water infiltration and there's more soil water for the vegetation to grow. It's a typical positive feedback. And one can make simple models about this system, and the same kind of dynamics appear in which you have, in this case now, this is high rainfall, this is low rainfall, and if you have high rainfall, there's a high vegetation equilibrium, and if you decrease your rainfall, your vegetation equilibrium decreases until a tipping point because of this positive feedback, and the system crashes. And of course, this kind of dynamics is important if we think about the problem of desertification. Yeah, so the positive feedback at this end of the graph is that if you have enough vegetation, there's enough soil water for the vegetation to be sustained. But if there is not enough vegetation, there's not enough soil water and the system will crash. Yeah, so also leading to a tipping point. Now, the classical example in ecology is the case of the shallow lakes, in which you could have two stable states. One stable state is dominated by algae, and the other stable state is dominated by clear water and microphytes. And also, this is a system that is dominated by feedbacks, and I will explain one of them because there are several. But one of them, if there is a lot of vegetation, and in this case, microphytes growing on the bottom of the lake, there is less nutrients. And if there is less nutrients, there is less algae. And if there is less algae, there is less turbidity, and that is good for the vegetation. So it will grow better. And this is also a positive feedback loop, right? And this is why you get these tipping points in these shallow lakes. A picture what you see a lot is this picture by a paper of Martin Scheffer back in 2001. And this is actually what spiraled the attention of tipping points, at least in ecology. Here you see again this graph that I explained on the bottom of this projection. And this is basically a depiction of what we call a ball and cup analogy, explaining the tipping point in the ball and cup kind of analogy. So in this case, for example, when there is very wet conditions, you have one stable state, and the system is stable, and you can perturb it, but it always rolls back to the same equilibrium. But when the conditions become, for example, drier, there could be a second stable state appearing, and then it could happen that if there is a large disturbance, the system could go from one stable state to the other, right? But because this valley here is quite large, the resilience is quite high, so you would have to kick this ball quite hard before it gets to the other stable state, right? And you can see from this figure that this resilience, which is the width of this arrow here, becomes less and less until the system will automatically fall into the other. So you can depict again the same graph again tilted a bit, and you see this figure appearing in which you have this equilibrium, tipping point, another equilibrium, another tipping point, and then this depicts the resilience of the system, because it's basically how much you can perturb the system before it goes to the other equilibrium. Yes, and I want to show a small video explaining this concept so that we are all on the same page. And then I will move forward to the early warning signals. Oh, well, I want to show you this picture and then the video. Because this is Salvador Dali, the famous Spanish painter, and you can see his last painting actually also depicted two stable states and a tipping point, which is really true, because this was actually at the honor of his friend. He was friends with René Thom. This is René Thom, and he was a French mathematician, and he developed back also in the 70s, I think, catastrophe theory. Also, this you see in the blackboard this picture here, which is exactly the same picture that I showed you, with the two stable states and the tipping points between them. But mathematically a little bit differently formulated. But still, this is exactly the same graph as I showed you before. Okay, now the video.
Yes.
Very large disturbance can cause the ball to roll. Imagine an ecosystem, for example, a savanna. This ecosystem is in a certain state, described, for example, by the amount of vegetation. This state is stable. This means that if we introduce a disturbance, the ecosystem will grow back to the way it was. If environmental conditions change, for example, if it becomes drier, this may change how the ecosystem responds to disturbances. The so-called stability landscape may change, introducing the possibility of a second stable state. In this example of a savanna, the second stable state is a desert state with little or no vegetation. Under these environmental conditions, only a very large disturbance can cause the ball to roll from one stable state to the other, so the system is resilient to disturbances. If environmental conditions change further, it becomes easier to go from one state to the other. Now, only a minor disturbance can already push the ecosystem from a vegetated to a desert state. A further change in environmental conditions might even remove the possibility of a vegetated state altogether. Close to this tipping point, the system is less resilient. This shift from one state to the other is rapid, compared to environmental conditions that were actually changing relatively slowly. In order to restore the state with vegetation, the environment now needs to become much wetter than it was right before the shift occurred. So we should be careful with changing and disturbing our ecosystems. Their response to environmental changes and disturbances is unpredictable, and shifts in ecosystem states are difficult, if not impossible, to restore.
Alright. But let's move quickly to the early warning signals. Because of course, this unpredictable tipping points that suddenly appear is not really what we would like as ecologists. We would like to predict what will happen before the tipping point occurs. But this is how early warning signals came about. So the classical tipping is what I just explained, is when you decrease or have worse conditions, and then you get a tipping point here at this point, and the system goes to the second equilibrium, and here it goes back. But you could also have what we call noise tipping, and that is because of a perturbance here, for example, that is large enough that carries the system across this threshold, and then the system will also collapse, right? And as I said, is that the positive feedback could basically generate these tipping points. So besides this curve, in which you have a strong positive feedback, if the positive feedback is not strong, you could also have curves like this, right? So where the tipping point is basically vanished because of a lack of positive feedback. So this is the range of conditions that we are talking about. Yeah, so now you remember maybe this figure in which it is depicted that when you move towards the tipping point, the resilience of your system is decreasing, is changing. And from that, actually, we can infer what we call early warning signals. And here again is the depiction of a perturbation large enough for the system to go to this equilibrium. Now, because of this changing resilience, we can derive what we call general early warning signals. And if we are far from a tipping point, we have a high resilience. And if you disturb the system, there is a very fast recovery, and there is a relatively low variance in the time series, right? And if you have low resilience, if you are close to the tipping point, the recovery is much slower. So if you perturb the system, it recovers much slower. And there is a relatively high variance. And similarly, you can study the autocorrelation in time series. And if you are far from the tipping point, the autocorrelation will be low because of the shape of this valley, so to say. And when you move towards the tipping point, this autocorrelation will increase and will become very high. So by studying this time series, you can actually read where we are if we go towards the tipping point. And this is being applied a lot it has been applied a lot in ecology, and it's applied a lot in climate science.
How do you get the time series?
You
What's the
can,
origin?
by measuring. So you measure in a period of time, you measure biomass, or you measure salinity in the sea, or you measure it's measurement in time.
But it's experimental.
Yes, experimental.
Max,
It's monitoring.
yeah, is it
Yes.
a good moment to ask a question, or shall I wait till the end?
It depends on the question.
Well, this kind of slide always gets me very queasy. Because first of all, these critical transitions in physics is from 1950s. So we have first
I think
transitions.
this will be a discussion point, I think.
Oh,
Yeah. If I listen carefully.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the discussion. Maybe it's already solved in the other slides.
Let's see.
Yeah. So we can tell from models. We can also do time series analysis for models in this case. This works in principle because when you move towards the tipping point, this is like again the model of Neumayer where I started the talk with. So if you increase your haberdashery going towards the tipping point, your variance increases and your autocorrelation increases. Right. So this is what you can call a proof of concept. Now, I want to note here that here I've plotted different types of transitions basically. So for example, here you have a large, a strong positive feedback. And here the positive feedback decreases, depicting the different kind of situations you can have in one ecosystem depending on the strength of the positive feedback, right? And you can see from this analysis that your variance and your autocorrelation actually increases before the tipping point, but also increases before this point. And actually, it increases anyway when you go towards the right? Which has to do with the mathematical characteristics of these early warning signals. So this is to say that if you have a time series and you observe increased variation and you observe increased autocorrelation, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you are approaching a tipping point, right? If you have no information beforehand about that system and you observe those patterns, it doesn't mean that you are approaching a tipping point because there could be a lot else happening, as I just showed you in the slide before. So I always like to mention the analogy of a car alarm. If you break into a car and there's a car alarm, the alarm will certainly go off, right? But if you hear a car alarm going off, it rarely means that's a burglary in a car. Often it goes off because there's a truck passing by or there's a kid hitting the car or something else that the alarm goes off, right? We hear a lot of car alarms going off without being a burglary, right? But this is the same kind of thing. If you observe early warning signals, it doesn't mean that the tipping point is occurring because there may be alternative explanations for those early warning signals. Now this is depicted in this graph, in which the blue kind of wobbling line is the time series. So whether you go to a tipping point or whether you go to a kind of an inflection point like this, or if you have no tipping point at all, you may expect the same kind of time series observations, right? So if you only observe this time series, it actually doesn't mean anything, right? And this is important because this misinterpretation is made quite often, especially in climate science. And I depicted here 4 papers, quite recent papers, with quite some impact, in which this concept was exactly applied as I showed you, in which the assumption occurred that the system moves to a tipping point. But actually, we have no clue what happens if you study that time series, right? But still, there is a lot of over-interpretation about that going on in the literature.
Is that, sorry, on the AMOC, are you adopting the relevance of the tipping point?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I can say a lot more about the AMOC, but this interpretation of so-called observation-based early warning signals for collapse doesn't mean that this system is going towards a tipping point. It can mean all kinds of other things. It could mean, but not necessarily. So these observations alone doesn't say anything about the future of the system, so to say. But this interpretation is made a lot by this paper, but also by this paper, in which they use the same data to actually predict when the tipping will occur. Well, they even don't know if there's a tipping point anyway. That having said, the potential tipping dynamics of the AMOC is extremely relevant. It's extremely relevant, yeah. But that's another talk, I think. Yeah. Okay. And maybe there's something that can tell a lot more about that stuff. It is very relevant. Yeah. And another early warning signal, which is quite interesting, is more derived from this noise tipping, which is basically depicted here, because every system has noise, right? So if you have a tipping point dynamics like this, and you move towards your tipping point in time, your system may, so here it always wobbles around the same equilibrium, right? Which is here the probability density of the state is depicted. So it almost always ends up around the equilibrium right here. But when you move towards the tipping point, this probability density will actually change, because here you will spend more time in this equilibrium, right? If you have a system that moves like that, blah, 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 right? So you get more probability distribution like this. So when you move towards the tipping point, you may want to study the probability density of your state, basically. And maybe it says something about the dynamic of the system, right? And with this, I would like to quickly move to the concept of spatial scale, which I will, of course, argue that is very relevant, because if we move towards the tree line, the tropical tree line, where the tropical forest transitions into the savanna, right? And this is where a lot of work is done. And for example, as a state variable, the tree cover is measured here. So you will see here this picture. The tree cover is a function of precipitation, right? And you see here a big blob, and here a big blob, right? And there is a range in which the blobs overlap, right? So this has been interpreted actually as 2 stable states. And when you move to here, from here to here, you might have a tipping point, and you move to the lower tree covers, right? And this is actually when you depict the frequency distribution of the tree cover. With high rainfall, you see this frequency distribution, so a lot of high tree cover, right? And when you decrease your rainfall, this tree cover distribution changes like this. So here you have a high peak here and a high peak here, reflecting probably 2 stable states, right? And here you have the concentration around this stable states. So this has been interpreted actually as, yes?
This question, how big the piece of area on which they compute the tree cover? Is it more like,
30 by 30
30
meters.
centimeters, okay, so I didn't see that.
And this will change in.
It's a tall person sitting from them,
So
so.
these are the measurements on 30 by 30 meters, right? So this type of graphs has been interpreted as multiple stable states and going towards a tipping point from high rainfall to low rainfall, right? And the suggested mechanism, the positive feedback mechanism, is fire. Because if you have a lot of grasses, which is fuel for the fire, you have a lot of fire and kills the small trees, and the small trees can never establish. And the trees will not compete with the grasses, so there's more grasses and there's more fire, right? That's the idea about this system. But note 30 by 30 meters, right? So if you extrapolate this idea, oh, and then the question, of course, is, I put this slide, then the question, of course, is this a bistable system with a tipping point in between, right? And if you extrapolate this in the sense that if you analyze where you find this closed tree cover and this open tree cover, along a gradient of precipitation, you will find this curves here. So this is the closed tree cover, and this is the open tree cover, right? Now you can see that both closed and open tree cover are found for the whole range of precipitation here, right? So meaning that for the whole range of precipitation, you can either encounter closed or open tree cover.
Max, is the graph real data or is it some image?
This is real data. This is real data.
It looks almost a flip mirror image of the other.
Sorry? Yeah, well, that's.
That would be very surprising.
No,
with
there
real
is
data.
no. This is real data. This is the data.
This is I can take a mirror and
But it has to be, right? Isn't
Yeah.
that like either
That's
there are
right.
trees or there aren't, so you have the 100% minus the other percentage, so you
Ah,
can
I
get
see.
this side. Okay. That's at least what I was.
So if you plot this on a map, and we can show actually where this bi-stability occurs on a map, right? Because it is depicted on a certain rainfall range. So this map has been published, and I would like to focus on the Congo basin here, which is actually forested now, but according to this map, it is completely bistable with savanna, right? Implying that if something happens with rainfall or with another environmental variable, the whole forest could basically collapse to savanna, right? Because it is bistable for the whole area. But something different happens if you enlarge this area. So if you do not look to 30 by 30 meters, but you look to areas of, for instance, 10 by 10 kilometers. And then we can classify not only homogeneous open or homogeneous closed, but also what we call coexistent states. And this is this purple line here. So this is where in one area of 10 by 10 kilometers, open tree cover occurs as well as closed tree cover in one spatial domain, right? And if you then depict what is completely open or homogeneous open and homogeneous closed and coexistence, you see that your bistable area where both occur under the same conditions drastically decrease. And this is actually decreased. So these are the situations under this line here, where both open and close occurred. And we can actually plot those areas on the graph here. And you can depict where those areas are located, where you still have that bistability. So instead of the whole Congo basin, the bistability is now restricted to these areas here, right? And if you look what happens in those areas, we can actually explain why this bistability occurs, or why there is open tree cover when you expect closed, or vice versa. And that can actually, for 99% explained by other variables. So by soil and by seasonality of rainfall, for example. So in this case, your bistability region is basically disappeared. It is vanished. Which of course is quite relevant. And on top of that, if we now try to explain what determines high or low tree cover, open or closed tree cover within those landscapes, we can, for example, look at topography as another alternative explaining variable than fire. And we can see actually that for a lot of landscapes of 10 by 10 kilometer, you can actually quite well explain if you have open or closed tree cover based on topographic variables. And actually this is now something that we are further studying. You can even make a map of those landscapes, where those landscapes are located, in which almost 100% of the open or closed tree cover is basically explained by topography. You can see here a completely red area, for example, which is actually a river, with a sandy river when there is no trees in the riverbed, right, for example. So it's completely 100% dominated by topography. In that case, not everywhere, as you can see also from this. So we can actually demonstrate this, how topography determines these open or closed tree cover by zooming into what kind of maps we can generate of those 10 by 10 kilometers where we study this. And for example, here you see a river that is actually very vegetated. And here you see a river that is conversely not vegetated. So the tree cover is completely determined by topography, but we cannot say beforehand if a high, or if what the topography actually, how it determines the cover. It determines the cover, but it could be in a reverse way, right? But at least it's a very important factor. So what we can tell from that is that there is apparently, for those landscapes, a very limited bistability. So instead of a tipping point between a tropical forest and a savanna, you can expect actually a whole range of coexistent landscapes in between, right? And a more smooth transition from savanna to forest and vice versa than one tipping point. And actually, so far we see a dominant role of topography and a limited role of the fire feedback, although we are still investigating that. We cannot rule it out completely yet. So instead of the picture here, the picture looks more like there's a whole lot of equilibria in between the two stable states, consisting of all kinds of spatial configurations of forests and savanna that is basically alternating each other. This is the paper where we publish this. So actually what we are doing now is rethinking this tipping point idea, in which we try to include this spatial scale basically. And then, so what we are thinking about now is how this classical tipping point idea. There's another early warning signal that I didn't talk about. I can give another talk about that, which is spatial patterning. But if you take into account these coexistent states and the spatial patterning of the system, actually, the system looks a lot more complicated. And the tipping point is actually disappeared all between the spatial patterns of the vegetation or of the state of the system, basically. So we are working now on a new theory to include this spatial scale base. Two more slides and one movie. This idea of coexistent states actually applies not only to the savanna and the forest, but applies to also other ecosystems and a lot of climate system elements. Yeah, I want to leave it at that for now. Because now I want to show the second video.
Some organisms are really clever. Plants, for example, improve their own growing conditions by increasing water infiltration. In this way, they can survive in environments that are actually way too dry. But it also makes them prone to suddenly disappear. In the face of alarming global changes, there has been much talk about such tipping points in Earth system elements. A tipping point can exist when the same environmental conditions can support two different possible ecosystem states, such as a vegetated and a barren state. A stable state is like a ball in a valley. If conditions become drier, this can cause the ecosystem to tip to the bare state. Water input then needs to improve a lot more for the vegetation to tip back into the system. A stable state means that when the vegetation is disturbed, there is a bit less, but this is only temporary. When a disturbance is too large and the system ends up below this dotted line, then it tips to a bad state. Plants can return when they do so in large enough numbers. Tipping is not so convenient for us. Healthy ecosystems are important for people, so we like them to be resilient and not prone to sudden large changes. Luckily, the notion of ecosystem tipping depends a lot on the spatial scale that you're looking at. Some organisms, such as plants in dry environments, can form spatial patterns. As the environmental conditions change, the patterns adjust accordingly. Through these pattern adjustments, the vegetation can adjust freely and gradually through what we call a booster balloon, avoiding the tipping point. Organisms, especially trees, do take some time to grow back. So if the climate changes too fast, the system can still tip. These insights are obtained mostly from mathematical, physical, and ecological theory, but models are clear, simplified versions of the real world, whereas the world is actually more like a big mess. Such spatial heterogeneity can also cause spatial pattern formation, for example, at the border between savannas and tropical forests. You see, plants can be rather selfish. They worsen conditions for plants of another kind. Tropical forest trees block sunlight so that savanna vegetation cannot grow. And savanna vegetation stimulates fire. Savanna trees are adapted to fire, but tropical trees are not. So savanna plants are bad for forest plants, while forest plants are bad for savanna plants. This results in two alternative stable states. Both savanna vegetation or tropical forest can exist for the same environmental conditions. In a spatially heterogeneous environment, a local disturbance in a patch of tropical forest can lead to stable spatial patterns. These patterns can also adjust to climate change and create stable coexistence states that allow the ecosystem to avoid the tipping point. So, in a world with underlying variety, after a disturbance, the system isn't immediately pushed to either the savanna or the tropical forest state, but it ends up in a coexistence state. The underlying environmental heterogeneity is necessary to get this coexistence of states in one spatial domain. We still must be cautionary with changing our Earth system because tipping can still occur under certain conditions. So it is really important to consider spatial processes when studying tipping points. Research on resilience in the spatial context also shows what happens when we take away space. With limited space for natural processes, ecosystems can still tip. So if we implement policies that allow space for natural processes, we create landscapes that are actually resilient in the face of climate change.
More slides, dus de take-home message en one commercial show. So, take-home message. I always like this one, space matters. But actually, those points are just as relevant, I think. So, nonlinear surprises should be expected, right? So it should not be a surprise, actually. So nonlinear surprise should not be a surprise, right? If we try to validate tipping point theory, we run into problems and uncertainty arises, right? What I showed is tipping is scale dependent. And what I showed is that further elaboration of tipping point theory is needed to account for complexity, basically. The tipping point theory is for most systems too simple of a theory to basically to verify. And just the commercial slide is this book will come out, I hope in the summer this year, about complex systems resilience and tipping points. This is also shown below. So look out for that. That's it.
Thank you so much, nice. The cozy talk.
So a little bit more time, but
Yeah, we have some time for some questions, if there are some questions, actually. I will maybe begin with the unresolved. Go ahead there.
So in some corner of science, the simple interpretation of tipping point that you showed at the beginning is very common, which gets me very, very quizzy. So thank you for clarifying some of the nuances. The question that I wanted to ask is that the simple picture of tipping and large correlation lengths or times and temporal correlations, etc. in time series. This is from in physics. This is from 1950s. So we have first order, second order, higher order phase transitions. They're very, very clearly defined. In the first order transition, in particular, it's a sudden phase transition. There is no early warning signal. So my question was that when all these things are said, from your perspective, could you say something about whether they actually do check whether this is a first order or second order phase transition, or just say, well, this is a phase transition, I don't care, there should be, that's kind of the impression I get from the literature that I follow.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, so people study this time series and then just assume that it is a system like with a
second order or higher order phase transition, right?
They have arguments for that, of course. I mean, it's not doesn't come out of the blue, but it's often presented as evidence that this is a system that behaves like that, which is of course not. I mean, there could be alternative explanations. But again, there is arguments for several systems to behave like that. One system, the arguments are stronger than another system, I think. But still, the principle applies that if you only look at the data, you cannot just infer that you look at the system.
And in fact, if I may add to that, so basically what will happen in critical transitions to second or higher order, then if you look at these correlations and so on, there's a certain scaling that works out. So So let's say you have a control parameter C and C minus the critical value. So they will scale with the power law with amplitudes and probability distributions and things like that. I don't see any trace of any of those kinds of analysis in this in this paper. So they said, well, there is tipping, MOC is going to tip in by 2050, and that kind of thing. So it gets me very, very uneasy as a scientist.
I agree, yeah, and I'm just a simple ecologist. I agree. That's I think a general problem in this question.
Yeah, I have an observation rather than a question. But following up on the last point, the tipping point of AMOC, we had presentations here by Potsdam Institute, Einstorf. He told me he wasn't sure about the time, so we talk about an episode. Now, the observation I'd like to make as an economist is that non-linearity in economics is rather rare. We love to think in causal logics, and the bulk of governance and policymakers does so as well. What kind of how we could close this gap of understanding?
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think there is science work that takes into account uncertainty in terms of we look at signals in a system and what kind of mitigation or adaptation measures we can already do now to prevent a certain direction of the system that you don't want, right? Especially, I think there's two concepts. That's the concept of shared social economic pathways that have scenarios, different scenarios, right? Also economic scenarios in which you can actually adapt your measurement. And there is this concept of adaptation, dynamic adaptation policies, developed by Marjolein Haasbroek, also a Utrecht professor. And she also develops like how you can adapt your adaptation according to changing certainty or changing uncertainty. So I think these concepts we can use to come with a kind of pathway of how we should deal with certainties and uncertainties. This having said, there is a lot of certainty in climate change and what is happening, right? So I think there is a lot of urgency for adaptation and mitigation measures, irrespective of whether a tipping point will occur in 2, 6, 5, or 300 years, right? But I think there are frameworks to develop policy to take this into account. Yeah. I think it's not well developed yet, I think, but it can be developed and it can be useful.
Delft has developed this dynamic adaptive policy pathways, DAP, they call it. They have
I thought Marjolein did that. Marjolein Haasbroek.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know it from Delft though.
Marjolein Haasbroek did that, yeah.
Yeah, so that's
Maybe together with Delft and together with Wagner.
Probably.
Yeah, it's a typical Delft thing, probably. Because they solve problems, right? So we should give this problem to Delft and they will just fix it.
Well, that's for sure.
I would just like maybe if there is one last comment or question or something like that, because it's one. So I saw that you had a question.
Yeah, right. It's maybe not that. It's maybe more broad question. I was wondering when you take into account spatial scale, the spatial scale as you showed in your examples, then this nice swallowtail curves, it gets diluted a little bit. So I was so before when this simple model existed, there was it at least felt like there was a lot of predictability. And now that when you take into account the more realistic dynamics of the system, it feels like there's less predictability.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask, what can one still say after going more realistic?
The predictability was never there.
Okay.
But I showed indeed that if you add spatial scale, you don't have simple two stable states, but you could have a lot of stable states in between. And actually, There's a lot more to tell about this. One thing I would like to stress is that even in computer simulation, we cannot predict where that stable state between those two stable states will be, because we cannot predict it until now. As you cannot predict if you boil an egg, you cannot predict where your convection cells in your water will appear, right? It's not unpredictable. This is just as unpredictable so far. We are working on it. Yeah.
Interesting, thank you.
So I think that's why we're gonna stop. I see that we have offered you 2 trees to plant in the Netherlands and Botswana, Bolivia. Thank you for your talk. Thank you so much, and thank you all to be here. Was a pleasure. Thanks.